As the battle erupted for the capture of the DFW International Airport, perhaps the single most important objective besides the control of I-35, both I-35E and I-35W, as well as also the destruction of the Naval Air Station in Fort Worth happening concurrently to the opening of the assault on the international airport as the invasion opened up. The defending forces on this site, the 2 battalions present, along with 500 paramilitary alphabet SWAT-like forces of the Americans, which were effectively filler units in terms of the needs of the defenses of the site, these 2 battalions effectively consisted of 5 companies apiece. Each one had their headquarters company, as well as also their 4 combat companies, or in the case of the 3rd of the 133rd, their 4 firing batteries, as well as the combat engineers having their 4 combat companies of combat engineers. As effectively these 2 battalions combined, along with the paramilitary forces, numbered nearly 2,000 total fighting men in terms of the defenders. The outer defenses of these defending elements had to be effectively cracked like a walnut shell. And as the first forces in to cut off all lines of retreat to the south as the armored battalions moved in from the north, from the east, and from the west, the air assault troops, with their exceedingly high mobility rate, were the first in to the battle to initiate hostilities, as the combat aviation companies, 1 in each of the 2 attacking battalions, came with 8 of their Z-10 attack helo gunships apiece per battalion. And they had kicked off the combat at the international airport by destroying 1 of the 4 present firing batteries, having had taken up their defensive positions created by elements of the 156th Brigade Engineering Battalion, also defending the site with them, as they had created dug-in earthen positions to defend the M109A6 Paladin field howitzers, as well as also sandbag machine gun emplacements, all of which easily swept aside and destroyed by the mass deployment of CH-901A loitering munitions, as well as the Z-10 attack helo gunships, as their task in this operation was to clear the landing zone and then back up their landed air assault infantry companies in each of the 2 battalions, as there would be 4 total air assault infantry companies in each of these battalions landed, along with their mortar company, which effectively was their ground-based fire support company. The combat aviation companies would effectively assist as well the infantry forces upon them being landed safely in their secure LZ, with effectively holding off any potential for there to be any retreats out of the international airport by the defending forces, or any conceivable possibility of reinforcements from elements of the nearby 3rd of the 144th, a mechanized infantry battalion, also of the 56th Infantry Brigade Combat Team, with its various companies dispersed in Irving, Texas, which was to defend various critical sites in that particular area. However, there was the nearest company of this battalion directly to the south, 2 miles away. However, they would never be able to effectively move in and assist their fellow embattled American forces because of the communications down situation. They literally had no way of knowing exactly where enemy forces were, what was going on, and when and where they were moving to at any given moment, because they had no actionable intel, because they had no working ISR capabilities as well. Everything satellite-based and internet-based or connected had been removed through the tandem anti-sat and cyber strikes, as well as also redundant communications such as radio being jammed by the local ground-based Electronic Warfare Regiment within the Reserve 59th PLA Group Army, as well as also the KG-600 electromagnetic jamming pods aboard both the JH-7s of the JH-7 Strike Aircraft Squadron, as well as also the H-6K heavy strategic bombers operating in this battle space. All of this effectively nullified any ability for the Americans to coordinate any wide-reaching, coherent defenses, as in being able to communicate over longer distances to coordinate multiple units over a larger area. This was virtually impossible, although there were primitive means of communication, such as runners or the free-traveling civilian population that could spread messages of whatever they seen in a given area, but this was highly inefficient and rarely worked, although there were times when it did assist a little bit, but not to where it made much of a difference whatsoever at all in the actual fighting itself. As the combat was well underway, as the first air assault infantry companies were beginning to be shuttled in, 2 at a time, 1 from each battalion at a time, as they were being landed and officially dropped off in the Bear Creek Golf Course, which abutted the International Airport grounds directly to the southwest of the International Airport. These forces would disperse throughout the south of the airport and even prevent the escape to the east of one of the outer defending companies of combat engineers from retreating south across the Car Rental Drive, which was one of the airport roads on the airport premises that ran east in an east-west direction. The air assault infantry troops, along with their attack helo gunship support with ATGM fire, 25mm chain gun fire, and even rocket pod fire, would absolutely eat up this assault, as the Americans would desperately hurl themselves into the skirmish line that developed, as the PLA troops already knew they were coming because they could see them where they began at, as their ISR network covered every square inch of the entire metroplex between their quadcopter assets, high altitude assets, and satellite assets. As soon as these forces pivoted and made a general movement southwards, as they were part of the east-facing outer defense perimeter of American units, as they moved south towards the Car Rental Drive, a bloody, vicious battle would ensue between they and the air assault infantry forces, cutting off their escape as intended. As the armored infantry forces of the 3 attacking armored battalions, as the 3 battalions each took a direction of attack, one coming from the north, one swinging in from the west, and one swinging in from the east. The armored battalions each consisted of their 4 tank companies, which effectively was 80 main battle tanks, although they each only committed 60 to the attack, leaving behind 20 or a company of their tanks to defend their anti-tank company, which was a long-ranged weapon-based company, as their exceedingly long-ranged and potent HJ-10s were a very powerful and capable weapon system in terms of distance fighting, but their weakness lay in up-close fighting. Therefore, one company in each battalion had been held back to defend these forces, as well as their headquarters and support companies, which they were responsible for the command and logistics of each battalion and commanded the operations of their specific battalions, and also effectively supplied their forces at the lines of contact in terms of logistical resupply operations. And they were also responsible for launching the loitering munitions at the battalion level, as each battalion possessed their combat drone section, and each section possessed a TEL system with 48 tubes to be able to fire 48 CH-901As in a single volley, which was enormously destructive, as a combination of their anti-tank company's HJ-10 massed missile fires, which were all ISR and real-time AI battlefield system directed, according to exact coordinates provided by the quadcopter and high-altitude drones. The AI targeting modes on the loitering munitions, as well as the swarms of loitering munitions came in, were equally devastating, and combined with their massed ATGM fire and the tank fire from the 125mm main guns of these very powerful Type 96B main battle tanks, and combining that with the artillery fire, both coming from the 19th Artillery Brigade's howitzer battalions, as one of two PLL 66 battalions would fire in support of this particular operation, as some of their firing batteries were committed into it, as was the case with one of two PLL 01 battalions within the 19th Artillery Brigade as well. The most powerful of the local PLA artillery forces, its PHL 03 battalion, was now currently firing at multiple other target areas, blanketing that with 300mm rocket fire in these different areas. Also, the two Type 83 multiple launch rocket system battalions, as there was one PHL 03 battalion and two Type 83 battalions, which were 122mm systems, these two fired at different other target areas throughout the Metroplex, while the howitzers were they which assisted in the fighting at the international airport itself, as there were 4 total howitzer battalions, 2 apiece of the PLL 66s and PLL 01s. It was one PLL 66 battalion and one PLL 01 battalion who had some of their comprising batteries firing in support of the international airport operation, although the vast majority of artillery fire came from the 35th Armored Brigade's own artillery, as this maneuver brigade had its own artillery battalion of the self-propelled PLZ-05 155mm howitzers. These contributed the lion's share of the artillery firing missions to the actual fighting over the international airport grounds itself, although again, the contributions of the towed howitzers should also be noted because they too contributed in this operation, although the vast majority of their firing batteries were committed elsewhere at this time. Some did assist in the fighting for the international airport. As the anti-tank companies, one in each of the 3 battalions, each fired multiple salvos of their very potent and long-range HJ-10 ATGMs with a max range of 6.2 miles, they sat back and away from the contact line as it developed and showered the battlefield with these potent ATGMs, as the HJ-10s were highly accurate and AI and ISR directed, just as was the artillery fire missions and the tank shell fire, as these very potent main battle tanks rolled into the international airport grounds from 3 directions while the air assault forces held the south. As fighting erupted in the west, as shown in this particular image, the western side of the battlefield was struck by the 3 attacking tank companies of one of 3 armored battalions rolling in a pincer action, with one company rolling up the center while the other 2 surrounded and pincered off the American Combat Engineer Company from within the 156th Brigade Engineering Battalion that was at the time setting a minefield in this particular area. Although they never finished it, they were also constructing bunkers which would serve as machine gun emplacements and observation posts, which were also never finished either, as they had been viciously annihilated by precision artillery strikes. The artillery fire also destroyed many other lives that were out and amid this killing field as the invasion had opened up, as in the field that lay between the outer perimeter fence and the diagonal-shaped runway and the outer mound, the berm that effectively abutted that area, that ran in a southeast to northwesterly direction. In between that diagonal runway and the terminal buildings was a series of maintenance and hangar structures that would take time to clear by the follow-up armored infantry companies, as the 2 armored infantry companies of this attacking battalion moved in after the 3 tank companies had cleared the area of American forces, namely the local defending company from within the 156th Brigade Engineering Battalion that had been posted to this particular side of the International Airport grounds to defend it and build it up. As to the south of this area, again, was where the Bear Creek Golf Course was on the west side of the airport. In the southwest was the Bear Creek Golf Course. North of this was the area that was assaulted by the armored battalion who committed 3 tank companies and its 2 armored infantry companies into striking in an eastward direction from the west. As at the same time as this fighting was going on in the western side of the International Airport, the fighting in the north and the east was happening concurrently. On the east-facing side of the International Airport, the armored battalion attacking on this side likewise committed 3 tank companies and its 2 armored infantry companies, but had very heavy air support from the PLAAF, who had 2 pairs of JH-7s conducting enormous airstrikes, as again, these were very heavy-hitting strike aircraft, and the addition of 4 other aircraft, namely a pair of J-10 fighter aircraft, which carried 4,000 pounds of air-to-ground munitions. The rest of their armaments were air-to-air munitions, and the vast majority of the J-10 squadron was mostly equipped with air-to-air munitions in general, as was the J-11 squadron, which also had a pair of J-11s with 4,000 pounds of munitions. These each, the pair of J-10s and pair of J-11s in this battle, each carried 4 1,000-pound laser-guided precision munitions and would contribute to the airstrikes being conducted on the outer American defending forces on the east-facing side. As there were 3 total companies on the east-facing side, there were 2 combat engineer companies and an artillery battery. The company that was furthest to the south of combat engineers would attempt to flee further south and would be cut off by the air assault infantry troops, while the artillery battery, an additional combat engineer company that were still on the east-facing side, would be heavily hit by the PLAAF airstrikes and the assaulting main battle tanks as they rolled into the area, the Type 96Bs of the 3 attacking tank companies on that side from that attacking battalion, followed up by their armored infantry companies, 2 apiece in each battalion. In the north, happening at the same time as, again, the fighting in the east and west was going on, was happening concurrently as we go to the map. In the north of the International Airport, there was another combat engineer company. Again, there had been 4 total combat companies of combat engineers and 4 total batteries of artillery, each with their headquarters company within each battalion, as in the 3rd of the 133rd had their 4 combat batteries, or firing batteries, their 4 firing artillery batteries of the M109A6 Paladin howitzers, self-propelled guns. The combat engineers had their 4 combat companies of combat engineers, and each battalion had their headquarters company, which was their command and some logistical elements. As the command elements of each battalion, the 156th Brigade Engineering Battalion and the 3rd of the 133rd, were in the terminal buildings in the center of the premises, the outer defenses would need to be effectively eradicated to get to these forces, to clear the terminal structures of the headquarters troops of the 3rd of the 133rd, the Artillery Battalion, and the 156th Brigade Engineering Battalion. But the fighting on the perimeter would occur first, as the air assault troops blocked off the south, and the 3 armored battalions attacked north, south, east, and west. Or not south, but east to west. The fighting in the north consisted of an area where the International Boulevard, which was the main airport road that bisected the airport grounds from north to south, ran through this area, as there was an outer perimeter road that was actually outside of the fence line of the International Airport grounds that ran around the outside perimeter of the International Airport. There were business and scattered industrial parks in this particular part of the Dallas-Fort Worth mega city, metroplex, and also scattered housing developments. This was a very suburbanized area to the north of this part of the International Airport. As the PLA forces moved in, they were entering an area that was 1 mile north-south and 1.5 mile east-west. This effectively was the northernmost edge of the International Airport grounds. Beyond the airport was a wooded field on the west of the International Boulevard, and to the east of the International Boulevard was yet another field with the industrial parks that were off and to the east of this area. As DH-10A cruise missile strikes and artillery strikes were already beginning to come in when this map opens up, one DH-10 strike had already occurred in this particular area, as indicated by this cruise missile and/or tactical ballistic missile strike icon. As this crater with smoke coming out indicates, this has been struck by a cruise missile strike, as no tactical ballistic missiles had been used in this particular battle as it pertained to the International Airport battle, and artillery was also beginning to crash down. Another DH-10A cruise missile was coming in from this direction and was about to hit this bunker, which was a machine gun emplacement and observation post. On top of that, there was a sandbagged, effectively observation post that was built on top of a machine gun emplacement, a machine gun nest constructed out of earthworks and beams, support beams, plywood, and sandbags. The combat engineers had created this to effectively watch the minefield area that they were beginning to lay that was actually outside of the airport grounds, but again, as this was an empty lot, they were permitted to lay a minefield on the opposite side of this road in this area for the outer defenses. They were to have done the same thing on this side, but again, because the invasion had begun before they could fully consolidate their defenses on the perimeters, they never were able to finish these projects, and instead were terribly overrun when the assault came. As the 3 attacking tank companies in this particular area were coming in at the same time as were their 2 armored infantry companies, because just beyond this area, the main airport premises effectively lay. They would effectively conduct a large pincer attack in this area, as it would be a little bit larger than the one that had occurred on the western side of the International Airport, because this attack would not just be a 3-company-sized effort like the 3 tank companies that pincered off the forces on the western side of the airport. This, in the north, would be a 5-company effort with all 3 tank companies that were attacking with their armored infantry coming in at the same time. As one tank company came in from the northwest, moving towards the southeast, an armored infantry company came in from the northeast, moving towards the southwest in a pincer-like movement to cut off this company of combat engineers that was guarding the northern entry to the International Airport grounds. The one tank company of 3 that was coming in from the direct north was coming in from this area, and others were maneuvering around these industrial buildings that lay outside of the International Airport grounds, many of which having to do with aviation or fuel storage and other types of sites pertaining to the International Airport, as the logistics for the running of the International Airport involved a lot of industrial sites that were immediately outside of, if they were not already located in the airport grounds. And as a result, this tank company maneuvered their different tank platoons, as they had 4 combat platoons, leaving their headquarters platoon behind, which was command and logistical forces for just the company-sized force. These combat platoons maneuvered in to set up effectively their firing positions to be able to fire further at targets off map if and when necessary to support their advancing armored infantry that were breaking through a barricade that had been set up at the entry point to the international airport, as this road effectively went beneath the International Boulevard at the main airport road here. Barricades had been set up by the combat engineers, as they had made barricades out of old vehicles that had been towed in and set up effectively. These were not destroyed vehicles, but they were just old vehicles that were used as barricade materials. They set up a sandbag machine gun emplacement right here, and they were planning to build up an even better barricade system, but this was just what they had done on an ad hoc basis, just as they were beginning to set up effectively machine gun emplacements, machine gun nests, bunkers, and observation posts to guard minefields that they were planning to lay on the perimeter. As they had their headquarters platoon campsite set up in this area right here, this was to be their TOC, or their Tactical Operations Center for their company. It was cruise missile struck by a DH-10A and artillery coming in and hitting at the same time. This cruise missile strike happened just before this map opens up, alongside of the artillery hitting as the map opens up. All of this is destroyed, and further up, further artillery fire, follow-up fire, came in as well, according to these imminent strike icons. This entire area right here, as this opens up, this cruise missile, by the time this map opens up, it's moving very fast. It's already hit this and destroyed this at the same time as artillery strikes had come in from the artillery battalion of the 35th Armored Brigade. Some of its firing batteries focused in on this portion of the battlefield, as artillery fire and the DH-10A strike completely annihilated this bunker, this emplacement. The drone that was effectively assisting the battalion attacking from the north in this area was a Wing-Lung 2 dedicated combat drone firing CM502KG dual-purpose anti-ship, anti-tank missiles, which again had a very high rate of penetration, as they could penetrate battleship armor, which is why they were dual-purpose missiles. And these outright annihilated an M1150 armored engineering vehicle, as well as a Bradley IFV. As this armored ambulance was rushing on the scene, it would check for survivors, but find none. Many things are happening at the same exact time on this map as it opens up. I'm attempting to show it in the order as it happened, but it's very difficult, as on the different sides of this entire area, very many things are happening at the same time. Loitering munitions are beginning to enter that had been fired by their headquarters and support company of their battalion, of the armored battalion. And the first 20 are arriving out of the 48 fired, with more inbound, as there was another 28 yet still to arrive coming in behind these. And as there had been sandbag emplacements for fighting positions, for defensive positions, these loitering munitions would come in and strike these defensive positions with their HE warheads that were equipped on these particular loitering munitions that had been fired from the 48-tube TEL-based system, as well as also ATGM fire from the HJ-10s of the attacking battalion's anti-tank company. Again, sitting further back and firing their ATGMs at leisure to assist their attacking armored forces. As the armored infantry was playing more of a direct role in the fighting on this particular side of the airport grounds, they would roll in and be claiming vehicle kills and personnel kills as they blasted through these barricades that were again made of vehicles that were basically towed into the area and rolled into the way as an ad hoc measure, at least while they were beginning to set up defenses, and fired at this emplacement, this machine gun emplacement, the sandbag nest in between the two sides of International Boulevard, these were turnarounds for when vehicles were, as these were one-way streets on each side of the main thoroughfare, they could turn around if they needed to, and to get into these airport maintenance areas. These were effectively buildings that served functions within the international airport. These were for airport employees, effectively, but now they were being built up as defensive areas on the perimeter, as there was another sandbag emplacement with massive amounts of sandbags had been filled and placed in this area. Vehicles had taken up position, as had some of the dismounts that got out of their vehicles and took up fighting positions to have their vehicles act as fire support platforms for these troops as they took up their defensive positions. Some were equipped with AT-4s, and there were very few anti-tank weapons in general because, again, anti-tank weapons were in short supply, and there were some available, but they were relatively thinned out in number in terms of having to disperse them amongst the different units, and some units got priority for more than others, and so on and so forth. That was how the supply situation was, as America had just come out of a very long and drawn-out proxy conflict in Eastern Europe where they had expended enormous amounts of vital stocks necessary for its own defense that had basically been pissed away to where now monthly production was nowhere near sufficient enough to replenish the stocks, and these units were terribly short on anti-tank weapons as a result, among many other types of weapons. As the Chinese had more than enough of everything, as they had the largest military-industrial complex on the face of the earth. They didn't have any problems like this, and plus they had enormous stocks that they were eager to use up and blow through anyhow, because these stocks had effectively been sitting there collecting dust, and they were more than happy to expend these weapons. As these tanks took up position, as this platoon rolled in behind this platoon, which effectively tactically created a blocking position to effectively cover the movement of this one behind them. This one spread out in the same way beside this one, and they laid down heavy fire on this area at the same time as artillery was coming in. These tanks were firing on the move at these forces as they moved in. These were firing stationary. As they fired, artillery came in and slammed these forces, while the armored infantry company coming in from the northeast, moving southwest, was firing 100 millimeter fire from their ZBDO-4A infantry fighting vehicles. They were firing 30 millimeter autocannon fire and HJ-09 ATGMs, while their armor personnel carriers were firing heavy machine gun fire, 12.7 millimeter fire from their turret-based W-85 heavy machine guns. And as they had not dismounted their squads yet, they would do so when it came time to clear the buildings as they rolled into the area. As they were conducting a pincer operation, they rolled in a column of vehicles, effectively, as they came in from both sides, as did the tanks, as they were going to come in and basically, with their ability to fire diagonally, completely cut off any means of escape out of this area. And as a result, these forces, too, using ISR-directed fire, could hit everything in the target area and beyond, because their weapons had a range of just over several miles with standard ammunition, and they had even longer range with their ATGMs that they could fire from their main guns. As the loitering munitions, too, could strike in depth within this area, they could go far beyond this area and hit targets elsewhere. These were mostly concerned with assisting in the destruction of these forces here, as the AI target-seeking mode effectively had these loitering munitions crashing into vehicles, crashing into defensive positions, crashing into troops that were dismounted, trying to get to the defensive positions. As these forces came in, they vectored their fire according to the real-time AI battlefield data processing system through the ISR network, as the combat data links effectively showed where friend and foe were at all times, and it removed deceased or destroyed enemy vehicles or personnel, respectively, as that occurred on the real fluid battlefield as it pertained to the ISR and what it witnessed from the quadcopter assets, high altitude, and satellite, as well as also even radar was tied into the ISR network to the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, all of which providing a real 3D, real-time battlefield view, fully mapped, of the modern, fluid, ever-changing battlefield as it evolved, meaning literally every single solitary change was noted on the battlefield as it developed, as it happened. As this cruise missile strike destroyed all of this, these tents and vehicles and troops were all removed from the combat data links. As an example, as the artillery came in and struck as well, as this cruise missile came in and annihilated this position, this entire bunker system was removed from the combat data link information that each and every vehicle crew and each and every dismounted squad had access to, as they all had vehicle-based and squad-level PDA versions of combat data links that the squad sergeants, NCOs, could observe and use to their advantage on guiding their movements, as the real-time AI battlefield data processing system guided these forces on their tactical movements and deployments of weapons as well. This is a very precise ISR and AI and combat data link full integration, as in a full circle of information, as the ISR provided the information, the artificial intelligence system processed the information, and it created a feedback loop by sending it to the combat data links and to commanders, and gave them advice on what to do and how to deploy their forces in the field. And it gave individual squad level troops information on where enemy personnel were and what weapons were best to deploy and when and where, and how to move and maneuver. So it guided all these forces on their maneuvers, and it guided the commanders, and the commanders could override, of course, the advice of the system, but they rarely did, because the system was exceedingly precise and constantly guided them to tactical victories all over the battlefield as it happened. As this Bradley, from this platoon of combat engineers, these 4 vehicles constituting one platoon of the combat platoons, these were headquarters platoon vehicles. This was an up-armored Humvee. These were LMTV trucks and a few HETs. This was a fuel truck, Max Pro MRAPs that were in defensive positions with the up-armored Humvee. This was the captain, this was the commander's vehicle, the captain's vehicle, and the first sergeant's vehicle, this up-armored Humvee. All of this was destroyed by tank shells, loitering munitions, and HJ-08 fires. It all came in and annihilated all this. This entire headquarters platoon was totally eradicated, along with the rest of it that was over at their campsite when the artillery and cruise missile strike came in. And this bunker destroyed by cruise missile and simultaneous artillery fire coming in from the PLZ-05 self-propelled howitzers, as these forces here were fired at by tank shells, loitering munitions, and HJ-08s. They too were outright annihilated as this tank company was moving in. These tanks were firing in this general direction. These tanks were firing in this general direction. And the armored infantry, which basically is mechanized infantry, but within an armored battalion, were moving straight down and into the airport grounds, smashing through the barricade after first firing and destroying the vehicles and then running right over them and crushing them into basically scrap, as these troops basically bolted when a 100mm shell from the lead IFV had earlier crashed into this machine gun emplacement in the middle, this checkpoint in the middle of the barricades, and destroyed it with a 100mm shell. 12.7mm fire from the follow-up APCs was devastating. It cut these forces down as they ran and bolted from the area. They were weapons staggered in a single column, moving down the road, firing at all these forces, including these troops. These two had been cut down instantly by heavy machine gun fire, as the vehicles were up on top on the overpass over this road. They could see everything quite well on this side, and a bit over on this side, although not directly down because this portion of the road would have been in the way. But orienting their fire downward, they cut down these two with bursts of 12.7mm fire and cut the rest down as they got to this point right here, as it pertained to the follow-up APCs firing down at these forces. And these forces, by the time these forces got here, they were able to be fired at by the follow-up second vehicle, the APC, the Type 89A, with its heavy machine gun turret. And as they smashed through They moved all the way down. As these forces were fleeing early on, they didn't make it out of the area. They were hit by two 125 millimeter tank shells. These were fragmentation tank shells, frag T shells. They impacted right here and blasted this entire squad into basically pieces of meat. And as these forces of this armored infantry company rolled all the way down, there are 3 combat platoons followed by their headquarters platoon right behind them. By the time they got into this position here, 1 platoon would face south towards the main terminal areas, and they would hold this position because they would need to do a logistical resupply for their final push, and their other platoons would need to clear all these buildings. Remember, at all times, they wanted the airport and all of its buildings and runways intact for use as a megafob. This was to become an ultra megafob, as this airport was gigantic. The airport grounds themselves were large, and they had a large, relatively decent sprawl over a lot of ground. The runways were simply enormous and could handle massive amounts of air traffic, including even being used as a PLAAF Air Force base in some parts of the airport, alongside of accepting massive cargo flights for logistical resupply and troop rotations as well. There was enormous potential to use this airport as a fob. The Americans were already trying to do it as a defensive measure, but now the PLA would capture this and use it as a forward operating base for their occupation of the United States, at least within this particular part of it, for their exploitation and colonization program after they had their victory in the invasion. As all these forces have been destroyed by a myriad of weapons, loitering munitions, HJ-10, ATGM fire from the anti-tank companies, the tank shell fires into this area. As this vehicle moved back, tank shell came right in and blasted it. A heat round destroyed this Bradley IFV along with loitering munition strike and HJ-10 fire. These CM502KGs annihilated these 2 vehicles right here, and this platoon over here on this side, as this APC had tried to roll up, as these forces were running, they tried to roll up, as this was the squad that actually came from this platoon, from this vehicle. This APC was this squad's vehicle. As they rolled up trying to allow these guys to get into some cover behind the APC or inside of it, as they were just rolling up to, so these guys could get to some kind of protection, although the APC did not offer much protection, as the M113s had very weak aluminum alloy armor. These forces were annihilated virtually together by the heavy machine gun fire from the APC, the Type 89A firing at these forces, and the others firing at these forces, as well as also 30 millimeter fire from the lead vehicle firing at them as they were passing through the area as well. As this armored engineering vehicle, this M1150, had tried earlier to retreat and then move over into this area, they were hit by a tank shell coming from this tank company and its 4 combat platoons that were spread out in this area, firing into this area, completely destroying it, as well as also loitering munition strikes that were coming into this area. Again, these first 20 loitering munitions on this map were only the first 20 out of 48. There were still 28 more en route. And as the artillery had completely drenched this area with heavy pounding from 155 millimeter fires, as well as the armored infantry company firing its infantry fighting vehicle-based weaponry, its 30 millimeter autocannon, 100 millimeter main gun, its HJ-09 ATGMs, their 7.62 by 54 millimeter coax machine gun, and of course the armor personnel carriers with their heavy machine gun turrets. They simply annihilated all in their path, including the dismounts trying to take up defensive positions behind sandbag emplacements, and some that were caught out in the open as well, as they were violently cut down by these attacking forces. The armored infantry would begin their first task as they moved in to effectively assist in cutting off any possible retreat for anybody who might be left inside of these buildings, although they would find nobody, as this particular company of armored infantry, while this other one came in from this side and the other tank company came in from this side, as the other 2 of 3 tank companies were keeping their positions, holding positions in the north and in this side as well, in the north. The three companies coming in, with this company leading the attack into the airport from the north, would break up into its three combat platoons, as its HQ platoon would be following up behind them, which are their command and logistical elements of this armored infantry company. One platoon would go and check this area, while this company came in and secured this side. This company came in and secured this side as they had intersecting fields of fire. This platoon would send its dismounts to check these buildings for anyone that was hiding out inside of them, while this platoon would move over and check these buildings, with the lead platoon assisting these two companies in holding off any potential counterattacks from the remaining American forces that were in the main terminal areas. There would be exchanges of fire coming from the south in the main terminal area to the south, firing back and forth between the lead PLA platoon of armored infantry and American forces that were holding positions directly south, as they had intersecting fields of fire as they moved in to pincer the area. The lead platoon also contributed to the fire, so they could fire in several different directions to the south. And as a result, these two platoons were fully clear to check these buildings for anyone hiding out, any holdouts. As the armored ambulances, as there were two in the area, one with combat medics that were checking these vehicles that had been earlier destroyed for survivors, this one went into this area after the violent shelling had occurred, as well as the attacks from the armored infantry vehicles, even the tank shell fire. They were allowed and permitted to move into the area. They were unarmed. Their APC ambulance had no heavy machine gun turret equipped on it. They were permitted to move into the area. They would be taken into PLA custody as POWs, as would this grouping right here, as these platoons spread out to secure the areas on either side of the International Boulevard, the thoroughfare that bisected the airport from north-south direction, east and west bisecting. They had by now already destroyed these troops that were out here, hit by a loitering munition strike as they tried to take up a position behind the building. As the loitering munitions came in and loitered over the battlefield, AI target seeking mode would find targets. As this vehicle moved up and this vehicle moved up, they were all hit by tank shells and loitering munitions and wiped out completely. As these troops tried to reinforce the defensive position, that was when the artillery came in, plus the fire from the armored infantry and the tanks of these two tank platoons here. As they were allowed to check for survivors, they effectively found none. This squad would survive, but they would all surrender. These would be POWs right here as this platoon entered the area, and their dismounts would check the building after this battle ended. They effectively all threw down their weapons and had their hands up at this point. They were seen on the quadcopter assets, and they weren't messed with at that point, and neither were the medics. They were all taken into custody out of this company. The rest were outright annihilated. Again, in terms of major assaults like this, the kill rates in these assaults were phenomenally high compared to past conflicts, as the artificial intelligence made and the ISR surveillance grid made the combat exceedingly more dangerous and deadly for the opponent, as the weapons were far better vectored than ever was before possible at their targets. I mean, this was like absolute precision. I mean, when it came to targeting data. I mean, they got hit with multiple different systems at the same time, or nearly at the same time, and they were also hit with a degree of precision in terms of the exact coordinates of these forces, even anticipating where they would be at any given moment based on the surveillance apparatus and the AI calculations, that most of the defending forces were outright annihilated, and at the least they were mortally wounded, and many perished due to their mortal wounds. And some mildly wounded would end up like these personnel and just give up, because after seeing their companies just ripped to pieces like this, many lost the will to fight because they didn't want to die unnecessarily if they didn't have to. But many yet still had the resolve to defend their land and do so in a vigorous way. Some of the troops fought very tenaciously, while others decided that they were willing to give in and throw in the towel, although their future would be one of toil and misery, as they would effectively be slave laborers for the Chinese colonists, as their land would be overtaken by the Chinese and converted into a colony. However, even after the victory in the invasion, a new phase of war would begin, wherein the Red Chinese would face an enormous insurgency as partisan uprisings would begin, as many, many millions of people fled their homes. And some of them, although not reactionary armed civilians at first, would opt to join the developing partisan groups as they emerged, and would fight a very long and brutal and gory and nasty war of attempted liberation against the occupation forces, who were vastly more high-tech and better trained and better armed than the partisans. But the partisans would be tenacious, and they would not give up. And although the American population would dwindle down to insanely low levels by the end of the conflict, by the end of the many years long war, they still would not give in. The invasion phase, however, was enormously rapid, and the Americans never saw it coming, and they would pay dearly for their lack of preparations and their lack of an ability to respond to such an invasion, as they had no such plans for such a contingency as fourth generation warfare. And even had they had any plans, what could they really do? The enemy was already inside the nation in strength, meaning that when they would break out of their CCP regime properties and go straight for the jugular, there was effectively no real way to stop these forces in their tracks, as they were dangerously near their objectives, to the point to where they were effectively unstoppable. As the fighting going on in the west and the east was happening concurrently to the fighting in the north, the fighting in the east side of the International Airport outer defenses will be covered in the next video installation of this fourth generation warfare doctrine series, utilizing a Sino-Russian coalition invasion of America to highlight these doctrines of war. More to come in the next video installation.